Here today to talk a bit about U.S. foreign policy and its position on religious persecution. U.S. foreign policy cannot continue to sanction religious persecution. Last year alone, the United States government on aid spent over $58 billion. $1.3 billion were spent in Egypt on foreign aid. $720 million were spent on Iraq in foreign aid. And $5.1 billion was spent in Pakistan on foreign aid. In each of these countries, the persecution of Christians and religious minorities continues to increase. Though a stated foreign policy objective of the United States is to promote religious freedom, we have to ask ourselves, are we meeting that foreign policy goal? It is my belief that we need to take a step back and re-examine the monies that we spend and see if we are meeting our strategic long-term interests. Now, history shows us that religion can be easily weaponized by governments and strongmen and used as a tool to diminish freedom and increase control. The weaponization of religion is something that we see today in Iran and something we see today in Sudan, where governments, acting in the name of God's will and doing God's purpose, promote oppressive policies and oppressive regimes for the sake of amassing control and diminishing liberty, diminishing freedom. Now, the founding fathers of the United States of America were very, very aware of the important role that religion played in a person's daily life. They were very aware that man, by his nature, was a religious being, or at least a being of faith, or had a propensity to be a being of faith. And so that is a truth. That is a truth that must be factored in when you're thinking about how to set up a governmental institution, how to build a democracy. And so the Founding Fathers wanted to avoid establishing a system which could be similarly exploited by theocrats or strongmen for the sake of amassing their power under the banner of doing God's work, while at the same time really just promoting themselves and their ideology. The Founding Fathers of the United States of America were students of John Locke and his teachings on religious tolerance. And one of the things that John Locke believed is that your faith, your belief, or true faith, true belief, cannot be achieved by coercion. You cannot make someone believe something at the point of a gun. And so in order to achieve true faith, true belief, and if your goal is to have a harmonious society, you will have a greater chance for harmony in that society if you allow for religious diversity. Because the more you attempt to coerce religious uniformity, the less likely you will be to have a society which is harmonious. So the Founding Fathers of the United States were, again, students of John Locke, and they took this principle and they kind of ran with it. And they came from England, they came from Europe, they came from countries where leaders often ruled in the name of doing God's will, and so religion and state were very much commingled. And so they were, again, very aware of this. So when they drafted the U.S. Constitution, the first important thing that they did was prohibit the official establishment of religion by the government. So what this does is it removes the potential of a leader who may come along, or political leader in the future, to use religion as his sword, to weaponize religion. But the second thing that they did, and I think that this is the more important thing that they did, is they enshrined in the First Amendment of the Constitution the right of every individual to express their chosen faith freely. So that power of faith, that power of religion, is held at the individual level. It is not granted by the government to the individual. So that provided a very unique check and balance against a regime that could come along in the future. So, contrary to popular perception, the Founding Fathers of the United States of America did not run from religion. They did not run from God. They did not run from faith. They did not run from Christianity. Just the opposite. They understood what a powerful tool it could be to promote the rights of man. And they enshrined personal religious freedom within the Constitution, but took away the power of the government to dictate what people should and should not believe. So, much the same way that our Founding Fathers understood the complexity of religion and the power of religion and utilized it as a mechanism, as a tool to promote the rights of man in the U.S. Constitution, I believe that our foreign policy community today should pursue a similar track. President George Washington, in his 1790 letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, said that the U.S. government will give religious persecution no sanction. That was a very, very interesting statement, he said, and that we will not aid in our policies in any way and sanction that persecution. So the question we have to ask ourselves today, and the question of this lecture, is does U.S. foreign policy sanction religious persecution? If you look at our support for the regime in Saudi Arabia and the persecution that's occurring there at the hands of the Wahhabi clerics, if you look at our support for Egypt and the persecution that has been occurring there, if you look at our complete silence on the persecution of religious minorities that is happening in many, many countries where we give foreign aid dollars and we have strong diplomatic ties with, then the answer is yes, because our silence is support. You also can look at the Baha'i faith in Iran, how they are persecuted. Look at the Ahmadiyya in Indonesia, where we have a diplomatic posture with that country and how we're completely silent on their persecution. Look at the black African Christians in southern Sudan and what they have endured, and the silence of the U.S. government and the silence of an official foreign policy on this issue. If you take all of those things into consideration, I think it is reasonable to conclude that the U.S. government's silence on this issue is its support and sanctioning of religious persecution. Now, one of the other things that I think is important to look at, because it provides kind of an interesting example, is the situation of Christians in North Korea. Now, the U.S. obviously doesn't have any substantive diplomatic ties with North Korea. What's happening is the regime in North Korea frequently tortures and kills people of faith. Those people often decide to kind of seek a better life and cross the border into China. Now, the Chinese government, knowing full well that if these people are returned to North Korea, will be killed, grab the refugees, take them back to North Korea. So what does the U.S. have to say about this, or should we say anything about this? Well, we have strong diplomatic ties with China, obviously, and strong financial ties with China. Why is this not something that's on our radar screen at all? Why do we have no voice on this issue? If our foreign policy goal is to promote religious freedom, why are we silent? Now, in the past, the United States has been silent on many human rights abuses for the sake of building and sustaining strategic alliances during the Cold War. So it was part of our strategy. It was a very clear strategy. We're going to ignore some of the things that are going on because we want to keep good relations with these folks. And we have the ultimate goal of bringing down the Soviet Union. Okay, fine. But what are we getting in return now? Are we needlessly compromising our American values when we have no end game in mind, no foreign policy strategy that we're trying to meet on this issue? I believe we must, at the very least, begin to evaluate the monies that are spent by the U.S. government in terms of strategic results. If I were to describe in one word the current foreign policy of the United States government on the issue of religious persecution, that word would be absolute avoidance. Now, presumably, this avoidance of the issue stems from a desire to not ruffle diplomatic feathers. And I think that this is not indicative of just this administration. I think this is indicative of many, many past administrations. Now, I think also that members of the Obama administration would say that does not hold true for us. All you need to do is look at the president's June 4th, 2008 speech at Cairo University. And in that speech, he called for all Hindus, Jews, and Muslims to worship freely. Now, that is a noble aspiration. That is a noble goal. But what he called for was the end game. He called for the end game without stating the problem. And the problem is that the governments of these countries are persecuting religious minorities lawfully in many instances. So how are you a force to change the problems that your country is facing if you refuse to acknowledge those problems? To the extent that we are taking no stand against religious persecution, we are empowering the persecutor. Our silence is our support. And the reason that we are silent on this issue is not out of a need to achieve some long-term foreign policy goal, but rather I believe that our silence is motivated by our fear of the unknown, our fear of what could happen. That is not a strategy. And the other thing to remember